Mitch Hedberg, God rest his soul, once famously joked, "What's the deal with refried beans? I want to try fried beans. Maybe they're just as good and we're wasting our time." And I've always kind of wondered about that when it came to using binders on big pieces of meat before seasoning. Is it necessary? Does it taste better? Do I need to use yellow mustard? Is unbound meat just as good and we're wasting our time? My name is Jeremy, and today on BBQ Elementary, I plan to find out those answers for myself. Let's go. After barely thinking about it at all, I decided that the easiest way to test this all out was to ensure that I could cook two pieces of meat at the same time, one with a binder applied before the seasoning and one with the same seasoning applied straight onto the meat itself, no chaser. So I went with spare ribs. 1, because they're easy to cook side by side. B, I've cooked them a lot and can do them with my eyes closed. And Z, because I gotta. I started off by simply pulling these out of their vac-sealed packages to pat them dry and prep them for the smoker. I'm going to turn these into competition-ready St. Louis-style ribs, so I counted out about 9 to 10 ribs from the large side and removed the rest. I did this for 2 reasons. 1, so that all the ribs cook more consistently. The small ribs at the end tend to dry up fast and sometimes burn up. And the second reason is to make sure the 2 racks I have are nearly identical after I break them down. I then also removed the rib tips and sternum, or what some people call the brisket bone, to square up the ribs even more. Then I quickly removed the membrane on the backside of the ribs, and the first rack was ready to season. For those of you who've never seen this done before, here's a little bit of a different angle to walk y'all newbies through it. Firstly, always make sure to cut open your pack on the backside of the ribs to make sure you don't gash your meat. Secondly, pat your meat dry with a paper towel to make sure juices aren't going everywhere and to make the meat easier to handle. This will also help prep the surface of the meat for application of your seasoning. Thirdly, you'll want to trim off the weaklings at the smaller end of the rack to make sure none of the ribs burn. You don't have to count out the ribs like you see here, but I wanted to make sure both of the racks I cooked were close copies. Fourth, you want to locate where the main ribs meet those small bony rib tips at the bottom and slice right between to separate them. Then follow that cut straight across the top of the slab to remove the sternum bone. Then all I did was make sure that both slabs were at least fraternal twins, did a few squaring cuts, removed a bone or two, and they were ready to season up for the experiment. It took me way longer than it should have to pick which one to add the binder to, but once I did, it was time to slather it with, you guessed it, yellow mustard. I should say here that the case for binders in the first place is that folks think that 1, it helps the ingredients stick to the meat easier when applied, and 2nd, because it's a little cheat code to help the bark form. For the seasoning, I decided to use the tried and true basic Lowry's seasoning salt with black pepper. This is typically what I use when making ribs for my family, and I have also competed in small rib competitions with this, and it always performs well. Just make sure to season as evenly as possible, starting with the backside of the rack first in order to preserve the look of the front side, and take care not to forget to season the edges. Once I laid down the last layer of black pepper on top, I gave the meat a little pat to make sure the rub was sticking. This little technique may also be something to investigate to see whether it's effective or a waste of time, but that's another video entirely. There are a few reasons that this method may have a fighting chance in this battle. Firstly, skipping steps saves time. Secondly, it's not as messy. Thirdly, it may not actually help the bark at all, so why would it matter to add anything? And lastly, that the meat is already moist and doesn't need the extra help. But at the end of the day, that's what I'm here to find out. And I probably could take someone else's word for it, but if I don't do it for myself, then I'd never actually know deep down. And I don't want to be the last lame-o that never knew for sure. Once the second rack was seasoned, it was time to make my first observations. Firstly, the second rack took a little less time. Obviously. Secondly, when it came to how effectively the rub was sticking to the meat, I wasn't really able to tell the difference. There is a chance that I lost some of the black pepper while moving the second rack, but honestly it wasn't enough for me to say confidently that either rack was able to hold the seasoning better. So for the first stage of the cook, the rack with no binder gets the edge. Next, I fired up the Traeger and preheated it to 250 degrees. It took about 20 minutes to come up to temp, which was perfect because that gave the ribs time to sweat and let the rub really settle in. I plan to use the 3-2-1 method as a loose guide, but really let the internal temperature and color be the boss. For the first 3 hours, I was aiming to hit an internal temp of about 170 degrees with good color, whichever came first. Once I got there, it was going to be time to wrap. After the first hour on the smoker, I started spritzing with water. Nothing too fancy, just every 30 minutes or so to keep the surface moist. During the last spritz, at exactly the 3-hour mark, the ribs were temping at 173 degrees and the color was a deep mahogany, so it was time to wrap. I used 2 pieces of aluminum foil per rack to make sure no accidents happened during the cook. The last thing I want is for a tiny rib to spill all the lovely juices out of the bottom and spoil my day. So after I'd gone ahead and prepped that foil and my gloves and liners were on, I pulled the racks to wrap, making sure to keep track of which ribs were which. After this first phase, I observed no visible differences in the way the bark was forming or how well the seasoning was sticking. So for this stage of the cook, the edge goes to the rack with no binder yet again. For the wrap, I decided to keep it simple and use what I typically do, Blues Hog Champions Blend. I like to put a decent bead on the foil, then lay the ribs, which were both cooking perfectly I may add, front down, and then add another bead to the back before closing up the foil. The idea for this phase is to cook them for about 2 hours or until the internal temp was around 200 degrees, whichever comes first, and of course I made sure I wasn't mixing up the racks. After about an hour and 45 minutes, the internal temperature was just under 200 degrees, the color was beautiful, and they were ready for the last hour. In this phase, they simply sit right side up and uncovered in their wraps to tack up the barbecue sauce they've basically been braising in. Sometimes I will add some more barbecue sauce or glaze during this phase, but I wanted to keep it pretty simple for the assessment's sake. And speaking of the assessment, I did not notice a single visible difference during this part of the cook yet again. After that last hour of the cook, the ribs were temping out at 207 degrees and they were ready to pull off the smoker. Alright, let me just keep it 100 with you all really quick. As far as the cook is concerned, these were near perfect. Look how bendy and tender they looked while staying all together, and the meat pulling back from the bones was crazy dreamy on both racks. Like, look at this thing flapping around. If these were any more tender, they would just fall all to pieces or tear down the middle. Perfect cook if I do say so myself. But enough patting myself on the back, let's get to the assessment. As far as the first impressions of the color goes, I couldn't see much of a difference in real life. As I'm looking at them in the video right now, the bottom rack, which is the mustard base rack, maybe looks a little darker in some spots, but I don't think it's enough to say that it has a real advantage over the other rack. So for the overall presence of the bark, the color and texture, I think it's safe to say that it's a tie. With the bark out of the way, it was time to look at the taste. I didn't really expect there to be much of a taste difference, if any at all, but for the purposes of the comparison, I tried to have an open mind that something would be slightly different between the racks. To make sure everyone is on the same page, the rack that is on the left of your screen are the ribs with no binder, and the one I've just cut up on the right are the ribs with the mustard slather. I went ahead and grabbed the 2 ribs that looked the tastiest and were the closest in size, and as you can see, looked pretty much identical to each other. This one here is the mustardless rib, and this one is the mustarded rib, both looking really great, but let's see how they taste. I started with the binderless rib, and to no surprise, it was delicious. Juicy and tender enough to make a bite mark without pulling off of the rib, and the Lowry's and black pepper is always just such a classic rub. Moving on to the rib with the binder. Again, not a surprise. No perceivable difference from the last, just the same amazing rib from before. But even though I was confident there wasn't a difference, I wanted to get a second opinion. So I brought in my beautiful assistant, aka my wife, to check my work.
Oh, wow.
And besides thinking they were really delicious, agreed that she couldn't see any differences in the taste or the bark. So, in conclusion, what does this all mean? Well, to me it means that unless you really just love the way that mustard makes you feel, there really is no need for it. And from now on, I'll probably be skipping binders, at least on the ribs at my house. But at the end of the day, do what you like because both styles turned out amazing. And as always, thanks a million for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't to follow me along on my adventures through BBQ Elementary.